Ferns tell you where the water is. That's one of the oldest pieces of knowledge in the Appalachian Mountains, and most people have forgotten it. If you see a thick patch of ferns growing on a hillside where the soil is thin and rocky and dry, a place where ferns have no business growing, it means there's water underneath. Not surface water, not runoff, groundwater. Seeping up through fractured rock from an aquifer that might be 50 or 100 feet below the surface, carrying just enough moisture to the root zone to keep those ferns alive in a place where everything else is dust and stone. The old water witches knew this. The dowsers, the men, and sometimes women, who walked the hills with forked willow branches and told people where to dig their wells. They weren't magic. They were paying attention. They watched where the ferns grew. They watched where the moss stayed green in August. They watched where the ground fog gathered on September mornings. And they remembered what their parents and grandparents had taught them about how water moves through limestone country. Not on the surface where you can see it, but underneath, through cracks and channels and dissolved passages in the ancient rock. In 1932, on a hollow called Goose Creek in Clay County, Kentucky, a girl named Elsa Prater used that knowledge to find the only clean water for miles. And she found it because her father, lying in a bed he would never get out of, drew her a map on a piece of bark and told her where to dig. Harmon Prater had worked the coal face at the Elkhorn mine for 15 years. He went in before dawn 6 days a week and came out after dark, and the coal dust went in with him and never came out. By 1930, his cough was so bad he couldn't finish a sentence without stopping to spit black into a rag. By 1931, he couldn't walk from the cabin to the outhouse without sitting down twice to catch his breath. The company doctor told him it was asthma. Harmon knew it was black lung. Every miner knew what black lung sounded like, and it sounded like drowning on dry land. He died in March of 1932, in the bed in the front room of the shotgun house on Goose Creek, with Elsa sitting beside him and her two younger brothers, Talmadge and Obi, standing in the doorway. He was 41 years old, and he weighed 93 pounds. In his last week, when he could barely lift his hand, he asked Elsa to bring him a piece of tulip poplar bark and a stick of charcoal from the stove. He drew a map. It wasn't fancy. It was a rough sketch of the hillside above the cabin, the garden plot, the tree line, the limestone outcrop, and above the outcrop, a patch he marked with short, scratchy lines that meant ferns. He tapped the fern patch with his charcoal stick and said, "Dig here. 18 inches down you'll hit rock. The rock is broken. The water comes through the breaks. It's clean. It comes from deep. Don't let anybody tell you different." Then he said, "The ferns tell you where the water is. Remember that." Elsa was the oldest of three. Her mother Desi had left when Elsa was small, walked down to the road one morning with a cardboard suitcase and got into a car and never came back. Nobody talked about it. Harmon raised the children alone, which in the hollows of Clay County meant the oldest child raised the younger ones while the father worked. Elsa had been cooking, cleaning, gardening, canning, and managing the household since she was old enough to reach the stove. She was quiet and fast, and did not waste motion or words. After Harmon died, there was no income. The mine didn't pay death benefits to the families of men who died of black lung because the company didn't recognize black lung as a work-related condition. There was no insurance. There was no savings. There was a cabin on land the family didn't own. The mineral rights belonged to Elkhorn Coal, and the surface rights were tangled in a web of old deeds and handshake agreements that nobody had sorted out in 50 years. There was a garden that produced barely enough to feed 3, and there was a piece of bark with a map drawn in charcoal by a dying man. Elsa kept the map in the inside pocket of her father's brown corduroy jacket, which she wore every day regardless of the weather because it smelled like him and because it had deep pockets. She didn't dig right away. It was spring, and there was planting to do, and the creek was running clean, or what looked clean, and the immediate need was food, not water. She put in beans and corn and potatoes and tomatoes and worked the garden from dawn to dark. She kept Talmadge and Obi fed and in school. Talmadge was old enough to help in the garden after school, but Obi was small yet, 7 years old and skinny as a fence rail, and Elsa made sure he ate first at every meal, even when it meant she didn't eat at all. She patched the cabin roof where the tin had blown loose in a March storm. She mended clothes until the patches had patches. She traded eggs from the 3 hens for sugar and salt at the company store, and never once asked for credit because her father had told her never to owe a coal company anything. She thought about the map every day. She'd pull it out at night after the boys were asleep and study the charcoal lines by lantern light, tracing her finger along the hillside her father had drawn, touching the X he'd scratched over the fern patch. But digging for water when you already had water seemed like a luxury she couldn't afford. There was too much else to do. The garden needed tending. The firewood needed splitting. The boys needed feeding. But by July, something was wrong with the creek. The change was gradual. The water took on a faint color, not brown exactly, but amber like weak tea. It had a taste that hadn't been there before. Metallic, like licking a penny. At first, Elsa thought it was just the low water of summer, the creek concentrating whatever minerals were naturally in it. But by August, the taste was stronger, and the water left a faint orange residue on the inside of the kettle when she boiled it. And Obi, who was 7 and drank creek water all day long the way children do, started getting stomach cramps. Orla Hensley's children got sick first, bad stomach cramps and diarrhea that wouldn't stop. Then the Messer children. Then old Luther Sizemore, who lived alone at the bend in the creek and drank nothing but creek water and coffee made from creek water, started vomiting and couldn't keep food down. By September, half the families on Lower Goose Creek had at least one person sick, and the sickness was always the same. Gut cramps, loose bowels, a metallic taste that wouldn't leave your mouth, and a fatigue that settled into your bones and wouldn't lift. Nobody connected it to the mine. The Elkhorn operation was 2 miles upstream, around a bend and over a ridge, and most people on Lower Goose Creek never went up that far. They didn't know about the waste pond, a low earthen dam the company had built to hold back the acid mine drainage that poured out of the mine portal. They didn't know the dam was leaking. They didn't know that dissolved iron and sulfur and God knew what else was seeping through the dam and into the groundwater, and from there into Goose Creek, turning the water into slow poison. Superintendent Floyd Brock knew. He'd known since spring, when one of his foremen told him the dam was seeping on the downstream face and the pond level was dropping faster than it should. Brock told the foreman to dump another load of clay on the dam face and not mention it again. The clay helped for a month. Then the seepage resumed, worse than before, because the acid water was dissolving the clay as fast as they packed it. Brock said nothing. Reporting the leak would mean shutting down the mine for repairs. Shutting down the mine would mean lost production. Lost production would mean no bonus. Floyd Brock had not missed a bonus in 9 years, and he was not going to miss one because of a leaky dam. When families started complaining about the water, Brock sent word through the company store that the sickness was caused by poor sanitation, by families failing to keep their outhouses far enough from the creek, by children playing in stagnant water, by people not boiling their drinking water. He posted a notice on the company store bulletin board that read, "Boil all drinking water. Maintain proper hygiene." It was an insult dressed up as advice, and every family on Goose Creek knew it. What happened next changed everything for Goose Creek. Subscribe to The Hidden Harvest to see how one girl proved them all wrong. Elsa pulled the bark map from her father's jacket pocket one evening in late September, after Obi had been sick for the third time that week. She sat on the porch in the cooling air and studied the charcoal lines. The garden, the tree line, the outcrop, the fern patch. She'd walked past that fern patch 1,000 times. It was on the steep slope above the cabin where the soil thinned to almost nothing over bare limestone. Nothing else grew there. No trees, no grass, just a thick mat of Christmas ferns, green and lush, in a spot that should have been too dry and too rocky for anything. The ferns tell you where the water is. The next morning, before light, Elsa took her father's mattock and a shovel up the hillside to the fern patch. She knelt and pushed the ferns aside and studied the ground. The soil was dark and damp, not wet, but damp, the way soil gets when moisture rises from below. She could smell it, a clean mineral smell, like the inside of a spring house. She started digging. The topsoil was thin but dense with fern roots, a tangled mat that resisted the shovel. She used the mattock to break through, chopping and prying, working in a circle about 4 feet across. At 12 inches, she hit clay. At 18 inches, the clay gave way to fractured limestone, broken, cracked stone with dark seams between the pieces. And in those seams, water. Not a gush, not a flow, but a steady weeping. Water seeping up through the fractures, cold and clear, pooling in the bottom of the hole. Elsa put her hand in it. It was cold, much colder than the creek, which ran lukewarm in September. She cupped a handful and brought it to her mouth. It tasted like nothing. No iron, no metal, no tea color. Just water. Clean, cold, faintly sweet with dissolved limestone minerals. The kind of water that old people in the mountains called sweet water and said was the best drinking water on earth. She dug for 3 days. The first day she cleared the topsoil and hit the fractured limestone and found the seep. The second day she widened the hole, following the fracture, chopping at the clay around the edges with the mattock and prying loose chunks of broken limestone with her hands until her fingers bled. She worked in the rain that afternoon, a cold October rain that turned the hillside to mud, and by dark she'd exposed a natural fissure in the rock roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide where groundwater welled up from somewhere deep. The third day she cleared the fissure completely and watched the water rise. It came up through the cracks slowly and steadily, the way water rises in a well, and by noon the hole held 6 inches of water, and by evening it held a foot. The water came from below the contamination. It came from an aquifer that had nothing to do with the surface creek, nothing to do with the mine waste pond, nothing to do with anything that Floyd Brock had allowed to leak into Goose Creek. It was filtered through hundreds of feet of limestone, the same ancient ocean floor rock that underlies all of eastern Kentucky, and it was as clean as rain. Cleaner than rain, because rain picks up dust and smoke on the way down. This water had been washed through stone. She lined the fissure with flat stones to keep dirt from falling in. She stacked limestone blocks around it to build a catch basin, a rough box 4 feet square and 2 feet deep. She mortared the gaps between the stones with clay she dug from the slope above, packing it tight with her thumbs. By the second night, the basin was full. 30 gallons of clean, cold water, replenished overnight, ready in the morning. She cut a poplar log and split it in half and hollowed out the center with a hand adze she borrowed from Luther Sizemore. Old Luther, who was still sick from the creek water and could barely stand, but who handed her the ads and said, "Bring me some of that water when you get it running." She laid the trough from the catch basin downhill to a covered barrel behind the cabin. Gravity did the rest. The spring produced roughly 50 gallons a day, a slow, steady flow that never stopped, never slowed, never tasted like anything but clean water. She stopped giving Obi Creek water that day. She stopped using it for cooking. She stopped washing dishes in it. Every drop that touched food or mouth in the Protter cabin came from the spring on the hillside. Within 3 days, Obi's stomach cramps eased. Within a week, they were gone entirely. Within 2 weeks, he was running again, racing Talmadge up the hill to the spring and back. His color returned, his appetite back, eating like he hadn't eaten in months, which in a way he hadn't, because the poison water had been stealing the nourishment from every meal. Elsa sat on the porch one evening, watching her brothers chase each other through the yard, healthy and loud for the first time since summer, and she held the bark map in her hands and whispered, "You were right, Daddy. You were right." Elsa told the Hensley family first, Orla and her husband Clyde and their 4 children, all of whom had been sick for weeks. She brought a jug of spring water to their cabin and told Orla to stop drinking from the creek and use this instead. Orla tasted it, and her eyes went wide because she'd forgotten what clean water tasted like. Within a week, the Hensley children stopped being sick. She told the Messers next, Boyd and Cordia Messer and their 3 children. Same result. Clean water, no more sickness. By October, Elsa had run a second trough line from the catch basin to a shared barrel that sat at the junction of the path between the 3 cabins. Hers, the Hensleys, and the Messers. 3 families, 11 people, all drinking from a spring that a dying man had marked on a piece of bark. Word spread. Other families on Goose Creek came to Elsa asking for water. She couldn't supply the whole hollow. The spring produced 50 gallons a day, and 3 families used most of that. But she showed people what to look for. She walked the hillsides with them, carrying her father's forked willow branch. She showed them the fern patches, the damp spots on dry slopes, the places where moss stayed green when everything else turned brown. She taught them what Harmon had taught her, that water moves underground through limestone, and that the plants on the surface will show you where it is if you know how to read them. 2 more families found springs on their own hillsides. Not as good as Elsa's. Smaller flows, harder to access. One of them barely a trickle that took all day to fill a bucket, but clean. The water tasted like nothing. No iron, no metal, no penny taste. Just clean, cold water from deep in the limestone, filtered through rock for years or decades or centuries before it reached the surface, completely disconnected from whatever the mine had put into Goose Creek. By late October, 5 families on Lower Goose Creek had stopped drinking from the creek entirely. 5 families that were getting healthy while their neighbors were still getting sick. It was noticeable. It was talked about. And it made Floyd Brock nervous. Floyd Brock heard about the springs in November, when a company store clerk mentioned that the Prater girl was telling people the creek water was poisoned and that she'd found clean water on the hillside. Brock drove his company truck down to the Prater cabin on a Tuesday morning and stood in the yard in his khaki uniform and told Elsa, not asked, told, that the mineral rights under that hillside belonged to Elkhorn Coal Company and that any water extracted from below the surface was company property. He said she was trespassing on company mineral rights. He said if she didn't cap that spring and stop spreading stories about poisoned water, he would have the county sheriff remove her family from the property. Elsa stood on the porch in her father's corduroy jacket, with the bark map in the inside pocket and the dowsing rod under her arm, and looked at Floyd Brock, the way her father used to look at men who said things they knew weren't true. She said, "You know what's in that creek, and you know where it comes from. And when the health officer comes through, and he will come through, you're going to have to answer for it." Brock told her she was a foolish girl who didn't understand how things worked. Elsa went to the county health office in Manchester the next day. She brought 2 mason jars, one filled with water from Goose Creek and one filled with water from her spring. She asked the health officer to test them both. The health officer, a man named Dr. Coldiron, who had been overwhelmed with sick visit reports from the Goose Creek area all fall, sent the samples to the state laboratory in Frankfurt. The results came back in January of 1933. The Goose Creek sample contained dissolved iron at 12 times the safe level, sulfur compounds at 8 times safe, and trace amounts of arsenic. The spring water sample was the cleanest water the state lab had tested from any source in Clay County, cleaner than the municipal supply in Manchester. Dr. Coldiron drove to Goose Creek with a state inspector. They traced the contamination upstream to the Elkhorn waste pond. They found the leaking dam. They found the orange-brown acid drainage seeping through the face and running downhill into the groundwater. They shut the mine down for 60 days and ordered the dam rebuilt with proper clay liner and a concrete spillway. Floyd Brock lost his bonus. He lost his job. He lost his company house on the ridge above the mine. The state inspector's report named him specifically, noted that he had been informed of the dam leak in the spring of 1932 and had ordered it covered up rather than repaired. The Elkhorn head office in Lexington fired him by telegram. He packed his personal automobile with what he could carry and drove out of Clay County in February of 1933. Nobody on Goose Creek watched him go, and nobody missed him after. The mine reopened in April with a new superintendent and a new waste pond that didn't leak. The creek cleared slowly over the spring and summer of 1933 as the contamination flushed downstream. By fall, the water was drinkable again, though nobody on Goose Creek trusted it completely for years. Elsa's spring never stopped flowing. Through the rest of the Depression, through the droughts of the late 1930s, through winters that froze the creek solid, the spring pushed 50 gallons a day of cold, clean water up through fractured limestone and into the catch basin she'd built with her own hands. The 3 families, the Pratters, the Hensleys, and the Messers, drank from it year-round. Other families came for water during dry spells when their wells dropped low. Elsa taught Talmadge and Obie everything her father had taught her about finding water. She walked the hollows of Clay County with her dowsing rod and her sharp eyes and helped more than a dozen families find springs on their own land. She never charged money. People offered $1 here, 50 cents there, a chicken, a sack of flour, and she turned them all down. She said her father wouldn't have charged money for telling somebody where the water was, and neither would she. What she learned from Harmon, she gave away for free, and the hollows of Clay County were better for it. People who knew Elsa said she found water the way other people found trouble, without looking for it, just by paying attention to what the ground was telling her. Talmadge grew up to work the mines like his father, but he also carried a dowsing rod, and he helped 3 more families find springs on their own land before he was 20. Obie went to school in Manchester and became a teacher and told his students every year about ferns and water and the map on the bark that his father drew with a trembling hand. The catch basin is still there on the hillside above where the Prater cabin stood. The cabin is gone now, burned in a chimney fire in the 1970s and never rebuilt. But the spring still flows. The flat stones Elsa stacked around the fissure in 1932 are still in place, dark with moss and settled deep into the earth. And if you clear the ferns away and look down into the basin, You can see the water welling up through the cracks in the limestone, the same way it did 90 years ago. History is full of people who were mocked until they were needed. Subscribe to The Hidden Harvest for more of their stories. Harmon Prater couldn't save himself. The coal dust was in his lungs, and it wasn't coming out. But he could draw a map. He could tell his daughter where the water was. And Elsa, quiet, stubborn, wearing her dead father's jacket with his map in the pocket. She dug where the ferns grew, and she found what he promised she'd find. Clean water coming up from deep in the rock, while everything on the surface turned to poison. The ferns tell you where the water is. They always have. You just have to know how to listen.